April 14, 1942. The war had entered its darkest phase. Europe was under the iron grip of the Reich, and ordinary life had been twisted into something unrecognizable. It was on this date, according to scattered accounts, that a single photograph was said to have been taken in an occupied city, though no one can agree exactly where. Some say France, others Poland. The image is grainy, aged and haunting. It shows a soldier in uniform lifting a young woman not as a person, but as if she were an object, a prize to be displayed. Around them stand other men, silent observers, watching with unreadable expressions. At first glance it looks almost staged, like a scene pulled from propaganda reels or one of the Wehrmacht's meticulously documented archives. Yet the woman's face tells a different story. Her eyes do not reflect fear alone. They carry defiance, a strange mixture of resistance and resignation, as though she knows the weight of this moment. Historians who've stumbled across this image in underground collections argue that this photograph was never meant for the public eye. It was not the kind of war image that newspapers would print to boost morale or justify conquest. Instead, it represented a private cruelty, a glimpse into the darker rituals of humiliation that the Reich imposed on occupied lands. Why would such a photograph exist at all? During Hitler's reign, images were weapons as much as bullets and bombs. Soldiers carried cameras, not simply to record battles, but to capture souvenirs, moments of dominance, symbols of victory over both land and people. The German military had already perfected the art of visual propaganda, carefully curating what the world was allowed to see. But the unapproved photographs, the ones hidden away, told a much darker truth. They revealed how women were often reduced to tokens of conquest, stripped of dignity in scenes that blur. Read the line between inspection, humiliation, and exploitation. Some researchers claim this photograph was part of a secret series, circulated quietly among officers as proof of control. Others insist it was confiscated by Allied forces after the war, declared unsuitable for release, and locked away in archives that the public never saw. And yet, through whispers and retellings, the story of the forbidden image survived, taking on a life of its own. The eerie thing about this particular photo is its atmosphere of normalcy. The soldiers in the background are not laughing, nor do they appear horrified. They are simply present, as if acts like this had become routine, a part of daily duty, no different than a roll call or a uniform inspection. That banality is perhaps the most disturbing detail. It suggests that cruelty had been normalized, that humiliation itself had become another tool in the arsenal of Hitler's army. The world may never know whether this exact photograph was real, staged, or recreated, but its existence, or even the myth of its existence, serves as a chilling reminder. Behind the polished uniforms, the marching boots, and the speeches of glory, there was another side to the Reich, one of shadows, secrets, and rituals designed to strip humanity from those who fell under its control. June 1942. The German army had already spread across much of Europe. Behind the front lines, away from the thunder of artillery and the marches of columns, a quieter and darker machinery operated. It was a machinery of control, humiliation, and exploitation, hidden from the world but deeply ingrained into the Reich's system. This machinery was the network of Wehrmachtsbordell, military brothels designed specifically for German soldiers. The myth of the photograph, showing a soldier lifting a young woman in lingerie as if she were a possession, fits chillingly into this hidden structure. For it was not unusual for women in occupied territories to be stripped of dignity, forced into uniforms of shame, lingerie, dresses, or medical gowns, before being delivered into the system that the Reich had carefully organized. These brothels were not spontaneous acts of soldiers with power. They were state-sanctioned institutions. The SS and Wehrmacht ran them with precision, as though they were running barracks or supply depots. Women were kidnapped from cities like Warsaw, Kiev, and Paris, sometimes taken directly from resistance families, other times rounded up under the promise of work. Many were deceived with advertisements for factory positions or service jobs, only to discover upon arrival that they had been selected as sexual slaves for the army. Conditions inside were unbearable. Women were forced to service soldiers day after day, often numbering dozens in a single week. Disease spread quickly, and the Reich responded not with compassion, but with cold efficiency. Mandatory medical inspections, invasive examinations, and brutal punishments for those who resisted. A woman was no longer a person, she was a resource, logged in records, monitored like a piece of equipment to be used until she broke. Some of these brothels were hidden within the walls of concentration camps. Ravensbrück, the infamous women's camp, held women who were transferred into what were called special barracks. Their purpose was not survival, it was to provide recreation for laboring prisoners or to reward guards and soldiers. Survivors later described these places as worse than death itself. For many, the humiliation and repeated assaults destroyed their spirit long before malnutrition or exhaustion could. The brothel system was not just about providing soldiers with comfort, it was about power. Hitler's army believed that by controlling women in such a way, they controlled entire populations. The message was brutal, but clear. The Reich owned your body, your future, your dignity. And so, images like the forbidden photograph, whether real, staged, or mythologized, reflected a truth that was far bigger than one moment. They symbolized the institutionalized degradation of women on a scale that history books rarely dared to acknowledge. When the war ended in 1945, survivors of these brothels spoke in whispers. Many remained silent for decades, too ashamed or traumatized to reveal what had been done to them, and when testimonies did emerge, they were often ignored, minimized, or dismissed as exaggerations. The world preferred to remember tanks and battles, not bedrooms turned into prisons. Thus the photograph, disturbing, ambiguous, almost theatrical, embodies not only one soldier's act, but an entire system of cruelty, a system designed to erase womanhood, to transform human beings into instruments of war. September 1943. Across the occupied territories of Europe, the sound of boots on cobblestone streets was more than just a reminder of military control. It was a reminder that dignity itself could be stripped away at any moment. In towns and villages from France to Poland, the Nazi regime had perfected not only the art of physical domination, but also the weaponization of humiliation. The photograph that shows a woman held up by a soldier, her body reduced to an object for the amusement of those around, becomes far more sinister when seen in this context. Such acts were not accidents nor rare exceptions. They were part of a calculated strategy. Humiliation was used as a psychological weapon to fracture resistance, to destroy morale, and to send a message. You are powerless, and we control even your shame. Public punishments became common. Women accused of collaborating with resistance fighters, or sometimes simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, were dragged into the streets, stripped, shaved, and paraded. Crowds were forced to watch, sometimes even encouraged to jeer, while soldiers photographed the events as though they were trophies. These images rarely made their way into official propaganda, but they circulated privately among troops, reinforcing the sense of dominance that the Reich demanded of its soldiers. In occupied France, for example, women who were rumored to have relationships with German soldiers were paraded half-naked through the streets, their heads shaved, their humiliation cemented in photographs that would haunt their families for generations. In Eastern Europe, suspected partisans were often subjected to degrading inspections, where soldiers would tear at their clothing under the guise of searching for weapons. The photograph of the soldier lifting the woman into the air can easily be interpreted as one such moment. An inspection, turned into spectacle, where the line between military duty and sadistic ritual was deliberately blurred. The cruelty of humiliation was twofold. On the surface, it broke the spirit of the individual. But on a larger scale, it worked to terrorize entire communities. When women were degraded, families and societies absorbed the pain, internalizing the message that resistance carried unbearable consequences. What bullets and tanks could not crush, shame often could. Survivors who later spoke about these experiences described the shame as a wound that never fully healed. Some said the humiliation felt worse than starvation, worse than beatings, because it lingered in silence long after the war ended. Many never spoke of it at all, fearing judgment or disbelief. Their silence allowed these stories to remain in the shadows, hidden from history's official record. The forbidden photograph, whether real or recreated, captures this unspoken truth. The woman's defiant gaze contrasts with the degrading position she has been forced into, illustrating the psychological battlefield that the Nazis cultivated. It is not just a picture of a soldier and a woman. It is a snapshot of power stripped of morality, of war weaponized not just against armies, but against the very essence of human dignity. Humiliation was never incidental, it was systematic. And in that system, the body itself became the battlefield. January 1944. As the Reich stretched itself thin across Europe and the Eastern Front, the war was no longer going in Hitler's favor. Yet within the highest echelons of Nazi leadership, there was still a relentless obsession with order, control, and domination, not just on the battlefield, but in every aspect of occupied life. One figure who played a central role in this machinery was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy. Bormann was not a general commanding troops, nor a field marshal orchestrating campaigns. His battlefield was the inner circle of the Reich, where policies were drawn up to dictate how soldiers interacted with the populations they conquered. Among these policies were chilling directives regarding women, policies that blurred the line between reward, discipline, and systemic abuse. It is within this framework that the infamous Bormann Directive emerges. While not a single document with that exact title, historians have pieced together memoranda and orders issued by Bormann in which women were discussed not as individuals, but as instruments of the Reich's needs. He supported the creation and regulation of military brothels, emphasizing that they were not merely for the soldiers' pleasure, but for maintaining discipline and morale. In cold bureaucratic language, he reduced the degradation of women into a matter of logistics, just another cog in the Nazi war machine. The disturbing photograph of the soldier lifting the young woman, her dignity on display before uniformed men, mirrors this bureaucratic cruelty. It is not simply an act of spontaneous abuse. It reflects a deeper, systemic belief that the Reich had the authority to strip humanity at will. Soldiers were not just allowed to humiliate and exploit women, they were encouraged, even instructed, to see it as part of their duty. Bormann's directives also emphasized secrecy. He understood that such acts, if widely known, could tarnish the clean image of the German soldier that propaganda so carefully cultivated. Thus, while soldiers privately circulated photographs of humiliations and abuses, the official narrative presented them as disciplined, honorable warriors. This duality, public heroism versus private brutality, allowed the Nazi system to function without tearing itself apart under the weight of its crimes. What makes Bormann's role even more sinister is his view of women within Germany itself. He once wrote that women's duty was to serve as mothers of soldiers, and he pushed for policies that relegated them entirely to reproduction and obedience. In occupied territories, that vision was twisted further. Foreign women were seen not even as mothers, but as bodies to be controlled, violated, or discarded. The forbidden photograph becomes, in this light, not just a shocking anomaly, but a symbol of Bormann's philosophy. A soldier lifts a woman into the air as if she were weightless, powerless, her value determined solely by those in uniform. Around them, the silence of the other men reflects the normalization of cruelty that directives like Bormann's made possible. By 1944, the Reich was crumbling, but the system of domination it created left wounds that outlived the war itself, and in every whispered legend of a banned photograph, we see the echo of a bureaucrat's pen, the cold, calculated orders that turned humiliation into policy and stripped humanity down to the language of logistics. May 1945. The war was over. The Reich had fallen, its leaders dead or awaiting trial in Nuremberg. Across Europe, liberation was celebrated with flags, parades, and promises that the world would never again fall into such darkness. But beneath the surface of victory, another story unfolded, a story not of celebration, but of deliberate silence. When Allied forces entered the liberated territories, they uncovered horrors that defied imagination: mass graves, concentration camps, starvation, and industrialized murder. Yet among these findings was another category of crime: sexual slavery, humiliation, and the brothel system that had stretched across the Reich's occupied lands. Documents, testimonies, and even photographs confirmed what survivors whispered: women had been kidnapped, violated, and systematically used as tools of war. But unlike the images of starving prisoners behind barbed wire, these photographs rarely appeared in newspapers. Unlike the meticulous Nazi records of deportations and executions, the archives on sexual crimes were not preserved with the same urgency. Instead, much of the evidence was deliberately filed away, hidden, or quietly destroyed. Why? because these crimes carried a weight that extended beyond Germany. The uncomfortable truth was that sexual violence during war was not unique to the Nazis. As Allied soldiers pushed into occupied territories, reports surfaced of their own misconduct. Soviet troops in particular committed mass rapes across Eastern Europe and even in Berlin itself. The Western Allies, while far less systematic, were not free of accusations either. To shine too bright a light on Nazi sexual crimes risked opening doors that implicated all sides. And so, the narrative of war crimes focused on camps, executions, and genocide, while the suffering of women in brothels and humiliation rituals was pushed into the shadows. Thus, a forbidden photograph, whether authentic or mythologized, fits into this pattern of erasure. An image that depicts a woman humiliated before soldiers did not serve the narrative of clean victory and justice. It did not fit into the image of the German soldier as simply a brutal invader or the Allied soldier as a flawless liberator. It showed something more complex, more uncomfortable, the ways in which women's bodies became battlefields, their suffering too shameful to put into textbooks or courtroom exhibits. Survivors who tried to tell their stories often found themselves dismissed. In post-war Europe, societies shattered by occupation wanted to rebuild, not dwell on humiliation. Women who had been forced into Nazi brothels were sometimes stigmatized, accused of collaboration rather than recognized as victims. Many lived in silence, carrying memories of systematic abuse while history marched forward without them. Thus, the archives of humiliation remained scattered, incomplete, or suppressed. A handful of documents survived in dusty boxes, rediscovered decades later by historians willing to confront what others ignored. And in the absence of clear records, myths grew, stories of banned photographs, hidden collections, and images locked away in military vaults. Whether the infamous photograph truly existed as a relic of 1942 or was recreated later, its meaning endures. It represents everything that official history tried to bury: the deliberate humiliation of women as a tool of war, and the silence that followed when the world decided those stories were too inconvenient to remember. 1979. More than 30 years after the fall of the Reich, Europe was still haunted by ghosts. Families remembered the camps, the starvation, the executions. But in that year, a French woman named Marie-Louise finally decided to speak publicly about what had happened to her. Not as a prisoner of war in the traditional sense, but as one of the countless women forced into the Nazi brothel system. Her words would open the door to stories that history had long tried to silence. Marie-Louise described how she had been deceived in 1942 with the promise of work in Germany. Instead, she was taken to a special house where she was forced to serve German soldiers day and night. She recalled the humiliation of daily medical inspections, the pain of repeated assaults, and the way the soldiers treated her as if she were less than human. Her testimony shocked the public, not because people didn't believe such things could happen, but because the subject had been buried under decades of shame. Her voice gave courage to others. Survivors from Poland, Ukraine, and the Netherlands began to come forward, sharing their own experiences. Some had been held in military brothels near the front lines, others inside concentration camps like Ravensbrück or Auschwitz. One Ukrainian woman remembered how soldiers would mock her while stripping her in front of others, insisting it was for inspection. The ritual humiliation, she said, stayed in her mind more vividly than even the hunger or the cold. This is where the photograph's myth becomes so powerful. Even if the specific image was staged or reconstructed, the survivors' testimonies confirm that such scenes happened. Women were lifted, displayed, stripped, and inspected as though their bodies were objects of conquest. The gaze of soldiers in the background, silent and complicit, is exactly what the women remembered. A world where cruelty was right, routine, and humiliation became a language of power. Yet telling these stories was not easy. Many survivors faced stigma in their own communities. Some were accused of collaboration simply because they had been in Nazi brothels, even though they were taken by force. Others were shunned by families who could not bear the shame. For decades, silence was their only refuge. By the 1980s and 1990s, however, historians began to collect oral testimonies, recognizing that the absence of documents did not mean the absence of truth. In Germany, France, and Eastern Europe, books and exhibitions slowly started to acknowledge this hidden history. Survivors, often elderly by then, stood before microphones and described the unthinkable, how their dignity had been stripped not once, but daily, systematically, as part of the Nazi war machine. In this light, the disturbing photograph stands as more than a single moment. It becomes a symbol of all the women who endured what was once denied, erased, or buried. Their stories prove that the crimes were real, even if the photo itself was mythologized. The survivors gave it meaning, turning silence into testimony, and ensuring that humiliation would no longer remain a forgotten weapon of war. December 1995. A historian in Berlin prepared an exhibition on wartime propaganda when he stumbled across a set of photographs in a private collection. Among them was an image that resembled the now infamous forbidden photo, a soldier gripping a young woman, her body exposed, while other men looked on. It was unclear if the photograph was authentic or recreated, but it sparked renewed debate. Why did these images, whether real or mythologized, continue to disturb people half a century later? The answer lies in the uneasy space between memory and history. History, as it is written in textbooks, is curated, organized into battles, treaties, leaders, and official events. Memory, on the other hand, is messy, emotional, and fragmented. Survivors' voices carry truths that documents often omit. Myths and rumors fill the silence where evidence was destroyed or suppressed, and somewhere in that gap sits the photograph, an image that may never be verified, but one that feels true because it reflects what countless victims described. The power of the photograph is not in its certainty, but in its symbolism. It captures what survivors testified again and again, that humiliation was a weapon. Women were stripped, displayed, inspected, and degraded until their bodies became tools of control. Soldiers participated, some eagerly, others passively, but all under the silent approval of a system that encouraged dominance as discipline. Whether the exact scene happened as shown in the photo matters less than the fact that thousands of scenes just like it undeniably did. What makes this history so haunting is how it was erased. For decades, governments and institutions chose silence. The Allies downplayed Nazi sexual crimes because acknowledging them too loudly risked drawing attention to their own army's misconduct. Post-war societies stigmatized survivors instead of honoring them, and so the memory of humiliation survived only in whispers, rumors, and half-forbidden photographs that slipped through the cracks of official archives. By the late 20th century, as survivors spoke and historians began to listen, the myth of the forbidden photo took on new meaning. It was no longer just a disturbing image. It became a symbol of resistance against forgetting. Each time it resurfaced, whether in underground collections, books, or even modern recreations, it forced people to confront what had been hidden, that war was not only fought with guns and tanks, but with the bodies of women turned into battlegrounds. And so, the photograph's legacy endures. Perhaps it was real, captured by a soldier's camera in 1942. Perhaps it was staged later, constructed from fragments of memory and imagination. Either way, it tells a truth, that the Reich thrived on control, that humiliation was policy, and that countless women endured horrors history tried to erase. In the end, the forbidden photo belongs neither fully to history nor to myth. It belongs to memory, the collective memory of survivors who refused to stay silent, of historians who refused to look away, and of a world still struggling to understand how easily dignity can be destroyed when cruelty is given the power of law.